Welcome to part 4 in this module on leading change. We're going to be talking now about how people generally respond to change, and specifically two of the most common ways that people respond to change, which is either they respond positively to an upcoming change or they respond negatively to an upcoming change. So when you announce a change or talk about something you want people to be doing or doing differently, something that's going to be changing about your ministry or your business, people have a tendency to either get excited about it or get negative about it. And as a strategic leader who helps people to manage change and get through change, we need to know a little bit about how people tend to respond to changes and how to identify when people are responding in a certain way, how they're responding, and then how to help lead them through that response to change to get to a positive outcome, to get them to hopefully accept the change in the end and move through to make the change in the end. So let's start out talking about the positive response to change curve. There's a curve that shows the responses that people typically have to an announced change when they're positive or excited about it. So a positive response to change curve, what does that look like? How do people respond over time? And this graph shows how much pessimism people have over time as it relates to a change that you've told them about that's coming or that is happening. And for a positive response to change, it means you've announced something, you're talking about a change, and their immediate response is, oh, that's awesome, yay, that's great news, we're so excited about it, right? That's a positive response to change. But over time, there'll be times as you're implementing the change that people's opinion will change and they'll start to get more pessimistic about the change. So this positive response to change curve shows how at the beginning, there was virtually no pessimism, they were just excited. Right? But then as time went by, they started to get more negative or pessimistic. And then hopefully eventually, if we get them through to the end of the change curve, they're back down to not being pessimistic again, and the change happens successfully. So let's talk about these different stages that people go through when they have a positive response to change. The first step or stage that someone goes to is what's called uninformed optimism. Uninformed meaning they don't really know much about this change and how it's really going to impact them personally, but they're really excited about it. They're happy, and they're just certain that it's an awesome thing, right? It's called uninformed optimism. They're optimistic and positive without really knowing very much, uninformed. That's the first stage, the first response of positive response to change. Second stage in the positive response to change is called informed pessimism, which means now they've suddenly learned or experienced more about what this change really is and how it really affects them. And now that they're informed more, they're not so optimistic. They are now kind of negative or pessimistic about it and doubtful, like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this was going to be so difficult or have this challenge or whatever. So now they've moved into the stage of informed pessimism and doubt. And this is the stage in the change curve where sometimes people are going to check out and say, nope, I'm not wanting to do this anymore. I'm not with you anymore. And they check out either publicly or privately. And that's the most dangerous part of this change response to change is when they get into informed pessimism and doubt. How can you help them get through that so they don't give up and check out? Because the next stage in the positive response to change is called hopeful realism, right? Which is based on hope, where they can see, oh, okay, yeah, but I think it is going to be a good thing. I can see the potential. I can see that this is going to work out. I think that it might be okay. And if you can get them to that stage of hopeful realism, now the pessimism hopefully is going to start going down, and they're going to continue to help move towards the change into stage 4, which is where now they have informed optimism. Before, at the beginning, it was uninformed. They didn't really know what they were getting into. But now they're more informed, they know the downsides, but they also are seeing and experiencing some of the upsides of the change. And now they're back into informed optimism and confidence about the future until finally stage 5 in the positive response to change, the change has been completed and everybody's happy and satisfied. That's the goal, to get people through the positive response to change curve. The thing is, people are pretty much always going to go through these stages. Even when they're excited about a change, they're still going to realize at some point, oh, this wasn't quite as easy as I thought. And then oh, but I think it might still be okay. And oh, yep, now I'm experiencing how this is going to be great. And yep, it was great. Everybody's going to go through these stages, even if they were just completely gung-ho and positive at the beginning. They're going to have times throughout it where they're going to have some doubt, have some pessimism, but then hopefully get them through it. But there is no guarantee that they will get through it. And that's where our role as a change leader comes in. We need to keep an eye on, where are my staff, even the ones who are positive and excited about this change? How are they feeling now that we're actually going through the change that we're trying to make? How are they feeling? How can I help them get through it to make sure they don't check out? All right, let me give you one example of kind of a more humorous example of a positive response to change and how it works in real life. Think about new parents, married couple who's about to have their first baby, and they just find out from the doctor that they're pregnant. What tends to be their response when they get the good news that they're pregnant? They're overjoyed, excited, super happy, right? That's the general response that people have when they find out that they're pregnant. Very, very positive. Probably one of the most positive responses to change that you can have is when you find out you're going to have a baby. So what happens? Uninformed optimism happens, especially with your first child. We're excited. Yay, we're going to have a baby. This is awesome. Life is great, right? And then at some point in the pregnancy, within the first few weeks maybe, or certainly in the first trimester, the mother doesn't feel so well. And her body starts to go through all these changes. She's sick, right? So if you're a woman who's had a baby, you know how this goes. And you realize, whoa, this is harder than I realized. I really don't feel well. Oh my gosh, this is what it's really like. That's informed pessimism, like, oh no, how am I going to make it through this? This is really hard, right? And every woman experiences this differently and to different levels, but that's your informed pessimism. Now, of course, you're hopefully not going to check out of the process, but you're going to get through that difficult stage and get into the stage of hopeful realism of, okay, hey, I think it's getting better. I think I'm feeling a little bit better. And you know what? I only have 7 months left to go. This is going to be okay, right? And then you move into stage 4, informed optimism. Oh, I'm definitely feeling better. We just went and got another ultrasound, and the doctor says the baby's good, and I am healthy, and we've made it past the critical stage. I'm really confident this is going to happen. This is good, right? And you get to that stage, and then finally you have the baby, and life's wonderful again, right? And you made it through. You went through the entire positive response to change curve. And in a funny way, as parents, we actually end up going through this curve over and over and over again through life with our children. Because as soon as you've had the baby, again, you're ecstatic and life's wonderful and amazing. And then the first week of the baby's life happens and you realize, okay, this uninformed optimism of having a brand newborn baby isn't all easy, right? We're not sleeping. We just feel we have no energy. The baby's crying all the time. This is hard. And you go through this change curve again with the brand new baby where it's really hard, but then there's hope and confidence and it gets better. And this kind of happens cyclically with our children throughout their lives as they go through new challenges, and thus we go through new challenges. So it's just an example of the positive response to change. So let's talk about the negative response to change. So people have also very strong negative responses to change sometimes. And you and I have all been that person at times, right? Where somebody talks about a change that's about to happen and we are not happy about it. We're not excited. Again, there's a very predictable response that people have when they respond negatively to change and how that response is going to change over time. So let's take a look at that. In this case, we're going to be talking about people's emotional response and how active and obvious it is versus how passive and withdrawn of a response it is. So let's start with the first stage, which is stability. It means you really haven't even heard about the change yet, right? There's no change going on. You're relatively stable like normal, and you're fine. Emotionally, you're fine. But when a negative change comes to you, suddenly life changes and things aren't fine anymore. Now I'm going to use an extreme example here because it's an easier one to follow. But let's assume that we find out that somebody that we care about a lot has just suddenly been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So that's an easy one to follow through this negative response to change. It's anytime you get news of a negative change like that, like a terminal illness, of course you're going to have a negative response. You're not going to be happy. So the very first response that we go through, the first stage we go through, and we get negative news like that about a change coming, like a terminal illness is, we're immobilized. We can't move, we can't think, we can't talk. We just freeze. When maybe we say the word what, right? What did you say? What? What? And we're immobilized. We can't even talk when we get really difficult news, right? And the next stage, right immediately thereafter, is going to be denial. No, I must have misheard you. No, that can't be right. No, the doctors must be wrong. This has to be a mistake, right? We go into denial. This isn't really happening. That's the next stage that everyone's going to go through in a negative response to change. And even no matter what the change is, it doesn't have to be just a terminal illness. Any negative change you're going through, you're first going to be kind of shocked, and then you're going to be in denial. And then the next stage is you're going to feel anger and just get angry about the situation. And you're going to get angry at the situation. You may get angry at a person. You may get angry at yourself. You may get angry at God or at the enemy. You're going to get angry at something, right? Because this isn't right. This isn't fair. You don't like it. And the next stage after anger is to get to what we call bargaining, which says, but how would what if we try this? What if we do this? What if I try that medicine? What if I change this diet? What if I do this and this and this? And we bargain. We're looking for hope, right? So we're bargaining for other options. And that's the next stage that we go into. How about this? How about this? How about this? And as soon as we've run out of things to bargain with, run out of ideas, and they all get shut down, that's when we move into the next phase, next stage, which is depression. Because we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. We have to accept it, and we're sad and depressed about this, not happy. And of course, that anger, bargaining, depression is the most dangerous and difficult time of this negative response to change curve, where we really need to help people through it. And people can get stuck in any of those phases, especially anger and depression, for a considerable amount of time. So we really need to help people move through those stages. And the next stage after depression is called testing, where we're going to test out possible ways that we could function in this new situation that we're being forced to go into, right? This new change. Okay, well, let's test it out. I'll try this. I'll try, is life going to be okay? What if I do this change? Is it going to be, it's going to be the end of the world? And you start testing it out. And hopefully over time you realize, okay, life's going to go on. It's going to be okay. It's not the end of the world. This is okay, and I'm okay. And you come to acceptance, which is at the end, the last stage of the negative response to change curve. So these are the steps and the stages that people go through when they have a negative response to change. And again, they're going to go through every step. You're going to go through every one of these steps. Sometimes you go through them extremely fast, like within a second. You might move through some of these depending on what the change is. But you're going to go through them at least quickly in your head, and sometimes not quickly. Sometimes you're going to get stuck on these levels, and your staff is going to get stuck on some of these when you announce changes that are coming up. And it's your job as a change leader to figure out, how are your people responding? Where are they on their change curve, either positive or negative change curve? Where are they? And how can I get them through to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage, all the way to the end, where people have accepted it and we've successfully made the change. It's not easy, and there's no guarantee that people will ever get to the end. Sometimes people check out and they don't get to the end. They don't ever accept the change. They don't make the change. So we can't force it as a leader. We can't make people do it. And there will be a certain percentage of people who just don't agree to go along with the change. But we can, as strategic leaders, as change leaders, we can help identify where people are on these curves and do whatever we can to help get them through to the next stage and to the end.